Hey there, everyone. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey, one that's both chilling and mysterious. A true survival story that will leave you on the edge of your seat. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? That's exactly how I felt on the night that changed my life forever. I've always felt like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. On my 18th birthday, that moment finally came. It wasn't just a simple birthday, it was the day my world turned upside down. I remember standing in the living room, my heart pounding in my chest, the smell of cake still lingering in the air. My sister's head was gently resting on our father's shoulder, her eyes closed, her lips slightly parted as if she were asleep. But then I noticed the thick beads of red blood trailing down her face. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to convince myself they were just sleeping. As long as I didn't look at the splatter of scarlet staining the couch or the pooling blood at their feet, I could pretend everything was fine. But the truth was undeniable, especially when the loud bang echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls and shaking me to my core. My mother's body dropped lifelessly to the ground, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, my mind unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before me. Another bang, and my brother's head slumped forward, a teasing smile still frozen on his lips. My sister, Lily, gently tipped over, as if she were going to sleep, just before her eyes closed forever. The last words my mother spoke to me before she died were, "Run," it was a command, a desperate plea for my survival, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my heart racing as I crouched under the shattered remains of my mother's favorite table. I can't remember how long I stayed there, hiding, trembling, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The room was eerily silent, except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I could hear the shadow moving around the room, its footsteps crunching through the broken glass, getting closer and closer. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by terror. My palms were slick with sweat, my breath shallow and rapid as I tried to make myself as small as possible, hoping, praying that the shadow wouldn't find me. But it did. Cruel fingers wound their way through my hair, yanking me out of my hiding spot and shoving me to my knees. The shadow loomed over me, its presence dark and menacing, the very air around it seeming to vibrate with malevolence. I remember the sensation of a spider's leg creeping down the back of my neck when the shadow with no face dragged the cold barrel of a gun down my spine. It whispered a command, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "Turn around," it said, and I could feel the protruding metal stabbing into my neck. "Turn around, kid." I did, very slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to face my siblings. They were still there, still unmoving, still silent. They were asleep, or at least that's what I told myself. As long as I didn't look too closely, as long as I didn't focus on the blood, the reality of the situation could remain a distant nightmare. But then, another bang, a gunshot, and everything went black. I didn't feel the bullet that tore through my flesh. I didn't feel anything. Looking down, I glimpsed the slowly spreading red, blossoming like a flower on my chest. It felt like being cut from strings, my body going limp as I hit the ground, just like my mother had. The world around me grew distant, the pain fading into a dull throb as my body became heavy, wrong, paralyzed. I remember lying there, unable to scream, unable to cry, the salty taste of metal filling my mouth. It was like being winded, the air knocked out of me, but I couldn't catch my breath. Rolling onto my side, all I could see was the flickering candlelight, the air thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. I rolled onto my back, trying to suck in air, but my lungs refused to cooperate. The shadow took a step back, opened the front door, and bled into the night, leaving me alone in the darkness. I don't remember the pain. I don't remember dying. It was as if my mind had blocked out the worst of it, leaving only the sensation of exhaustion. I felt it tightening its grip around my brain, dragging me back into a mountain of pillows, back into the comforting darkness. I tried to move, but my limbs were so heavy, so tired. I wasn't sure what death felt like, but it wasn't pain. It was like going to sleep, like sinking into lukewarm depths on a summer's day. Oblivion wasn't terrifying, it was peaceful, inevitable. It was endless nothingness, a void that I found myself gravitating towards. But before I could fully envelop myself in that darkness, it spat me back out. The next thing I knew, I was in a white room, a slow beeping sound tearing me from slumber. My body felt wrong, heavy and numb, as if it didn't belong to me. I had a vague memory of roses spreading across my shirt like summer flowers blooming, a crimson bloom that was both beautiful and terrifying. Everything around me was white: the walls, the ceiling, even my clothes. The sensation hit me in slow waves, exhaustion washing over me, pulling me back into unconsciousness. When I tried to jump up, my body refused to obey. My limbs were like lead, heavy and unresponsive. I could barely keep my eyes open, blinking several times to stay awake. My Aunt May was sitting next to me on a plastic chair, her warm fingers entangled in mine. Aunt May and Mom were practically twins, with the same thick red hair and pale skin. Mom wore her hair in a casual ponytail, while May preferred a strict bun. I had to bite back the urge to yank my hand away. Aunt May was asleep, used tissues filling her lap, her face pale and drawn, as if she had been crying for hours. There was a nurse pottering around the room, checking my vitals, pricking my arms with needles. Her voice was like a wind chime, soft and soothing, but there was something unsettling about her smile. It was forced, almost mechanical, as if she were trying to reassure me but couldn't quite manage it. "Charlie," the nurse said, her voice gentle, "you were in an accident, sweetie. Just try and rest." Okay, I wanted to ask where my family was, but I already knew the answer. They were dead. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt their loss deep in my soul. The nurse knew it too. Her eyes were full of pity, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the IV in my arm. "You died," Charlie, the nurse continued, her voice eerily calm. "You were dead for 13 minutes." She took slow steps towards me, her eyes growing frenzied, as if she couldn't understand what she was seeing. "You were pronounced dead at 3:02 a.m. From a gunshot wound to the chest, her voice wavered as she tried to smile, but it was more of a grimace. "The bullet went through the right ventricle of your heart and severely damaged your left lung, rendering you unable to breathe. Your heart stopped, and after 4 attempts to resuscitate, we called it." I felt something slimy winding its way up my throat as the nurse began to pace the room. Her voice was starting to break, her calm facade crumbling. "I did all the paperwork," she said, her voice shaky. "It took me 2 minutes. Your death certificate was signed, and your body was taken to the morgue to be prepped for transportation. Then I had my lunch, a tuna salad with a protein milkshake." Not a fan of the chocolate flavor, she shook her head, as if the memory of her lunch was more important than the fact that I had been dead. The nurse moved closer, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "When I came back to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you were awake. Inside your body bag, I could feel myself moving back, panic rising in my chest." The nurse spoke calmly, but there was a tremor in her voice, a hint of hysteria. "How the hell are you alive, Charlie?" I think I passed out after that. When I woke up again, my head was a lot less heavy, and the nurse was gone. Slowly, my foggy brain began to find itself, to connect the dots. My mouth was dry and full of cotton, my throat sore from the breathing tube that had been shoved down it. There was a sudden tightness in my wrist, something sharp protruding into my flesh. No matter how many times I wrenched my arm, it was stuck. It didn't feel right, being able to breathe so easily, knowing that my mom, my sister, and my brother were dead. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I found my voice, a strangled cry escaping my lips. "Get it out," I whispered, my voice hoarse and shaky. I tugged at the IV in my wrist, trying to yank the needle from my skin. "Get it out," I shrieked, my gaze glued to the tiny spots of blood staining the insertion point. I could see it again, so much blood. My mom was curled up on the floor, lying in a slow-spreading pool of red that wouldn't stop seeping across her favorite rug. She was all over me, slick on my skin, caked under my fingernails. I couldn't wash her off of me, no matter how hard I tried. "You're okay, Charlotte," Aunt May's voice came from my right, startling me back to reality. The world started to move again, started to make sense. She cupped my cheeks and told me to breathe, her voice soft and soothing. When I opened my mouth to ask where my family was, she lightly shook her head, and I swallowed my words. Aunt May handed me a glass of water, and I drained it in one gulp. She told me that I was a miracle, that I had survived something no one else could have. But I didn't feel like a miracle. I felt like a ghost, haunting a body that didn't belong to me. Aunt May didn't say much after that. When she did, her voice broke into sobs, her eyes raw from crying. She clung to me like I was the only thing keeping her afloat, her shuddering voice reassuring me that I was going to be okay. But I wasn't. How could I be? My family was dead, and I was the only one left. I would be living with Aunt May from now on, she said, before wrapping me in a hug and leaving to get a coffee. Once my aunt was gone, another nurse came to check my IV. I tried to sleep, but the uncomfortable tightness of the needle sticking into my skin and the sterile white lights in my eyes made it impossible. I waited for grief to catch up with me, to drown me in a hollow oblivion that I wouldn't be able to claw my way out of. But I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I just felt numb. I wanted to know why my family was dead, why I was still breathing when their skin was cold and rotting. The sudden image of maggots crawling up my brother's nose sent me lurching into a sitting position, my stomach heaving. Reaching for my glass of water, I found it empty, the sensation of throwing up almost comforting in its familiarity. The days following my resurrection were a blur. It felt like time was moving in slow motion, every minute stretching into an eternity. Aunt May took me home, or what was supposed to be home, but it didn't feel like it anymore. The house was eerily silent, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains sending shivers down my spine. It was as if the very walls were mourning the loss of my family. I couldn't escape the memories that haunted every corner, the faint smell of my mother's perfume in the hallway, the sound of my sister's laughter echoing in the empty rooms, the image of my brother's teasing smile frozen in time. But the worst part was the feeling that something was wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the grief gnawing at my insides, it was something more sinister, something that lurked just beyond the edges of my consciousness. It started small, with little things that could easily be dismissed as my imagination playing tricks on me. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flit across the room when I wasn't looking directly at them. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in strange places, as if someone or something was toying with me. Aunt May tried to be there for me, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the way her hands would tremble slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. She was grieving too, but she was also afraid of what had happened to me, afraid of what I might become. She would often watch me from across the room, her gaze intense and filled with a mixture of pity and fear. She didn't say it, but I could tell she was waiting for something, waiting for the moment when I would break, when the weight of everything that had happened would finally crush me. And then the accidents started happening. At first, they were easy to explain away, just a string of bad luck, nothing more. I choked on a piece of chicken at dinner, my throat closing up as if something was strangling me from the inside. Aunt May had to perform the Heimlich maneuver to save me, her face pale and terrified as she watched me gasp for air. A few days later, I slipped in the shower, my feet flying out from under me as if the floor had turned to ice. I cracked my head on the edge of the tub and spent the rest of the night in the emergency room, getting stitches while Aunt May hovered anxiously by my side. But as the days went on, the accidents became harder to dismiss. I almost drowned in the pool one afternoon, my foot getting caught in a stray netting that shouldn't have been there. I was only saved because Aunt May happened to come outside at that exact moment, her scream echoing through the yard as she dove in to pull me out. Another time, I locked myself in the freezer while getting ice cream, even though the door didn't have a lock. I pounded on the door until my fists were bruised and bloody, the cold seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter and my vision blur. Aunt May found me just in time, her face as white as the frost-covered walls as she yanked the door open and dragged me out. It was as if death was stalking me, trying to claim me in every way possible. But it wasn't just random accident, something else was coming for me. I could feel its presence, a dark shadow that lingered just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. It followed me everywhere, a constant, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. I couldn't escape it, no matter where I went or what I did. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. The first real encounter with the dead happened when I was 12. It was the middle of the night, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing, filled with thoughts of the day's events, of the strange feeling that had settled over the house since my family's death. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around my legs as I fought to find a comfortable position. And then I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was making that noise. But I couldn't help myself. Slowly I turned my head, my eyes drifting towards the window, and that's when I saw him. A boy no older than I was, standing outside the window. His face was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression on his face. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a tattered shirt and pants that looked like they belonged to another era. But what struck me the most was the blood-thick, dark blood that oozed from a gaping wound in his chest, staining his clothes and dripping down his body. I recognized him immediately. It was Ren Oliver, a boy who had gone missing several years ago. They had found his body in a ditch a week later, his death ruled an accident, though the wounds on his body suggested otherwise. But here he was, standing outside my window as if he had never died. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think. All I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Ren didn't speak, but his intentions were clear. He wanted to come inside. He wanted to be let in. But I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to open the window. All I could do was watch as he pressed his hand against the glass, his fingers leaving streaks of blood as he tried to push his way through. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanishing into the night like a ghost. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, saw the blood, saw the hollow look in his eyes. I tried to tell Aunt May about it the next morning, but she just brushed it off as a bad dream, a product of my overactive imagination. But I knew it wasn't a dream. Ren Oliver had come for me, and I had a feeling he would be back. And I was right. The next time I saw him, it was in the middle of the day. I was in the kitchen, cutting myself a slice of cake, when I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. He didn't look like the boy I had seen outside my window. He looked older, more feral, with wild eyes and a twisted smile that sent shivers down my spine. In his hand, he held a knife, one of Aunt May's favorite kitchen knives. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white as he took a step towards me. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, cornered by a boy who shouldn't have been alive, who shouldn't have been there at all. Ren didn't speak, didn't make a sound as he moved closer, the blade glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. I tried to scream, tried to call for help, but the words caught in my throat, choking me. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as Ren closed the distance between us, his eyes gleaming with something dark and malevolent. He raised the knife, and for a moment, I thought it was over, thought I was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanishing into thin air, leaving me standing there, trembling, the knife clattering to the floor at my feet. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, didn't understand why this was happening to me. But I knew one thing for sure: Ren Oliver was trying to kill me, just like he had tried to kill me when I was 12. And I had a feeling he wouldn't stop until he succeeded. Aunt May found me a few minutes later, still on the floor, the knife lying beside me. She knelt down in front of me, her expression a mix of concern and fear. "Sweetie," she said softly, her voice trembling. What happened? I tried to tell her, tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. I was too shaken, too terrified to speak. All I could do was stare at her, my eyes wide with fear. "Ren Oliver is dead," Aunt May said firmly, her voice shaky. "He's been dead for years. You need to let him go, Charlotte. You need to stop letting him haunt you," but I couldn't. I couldn't let him go, because I knew he wasn't just a ghost. He was something more, something darker, something that wanted me dead. After that, the hauntings became more frequent, more intense. I would see Ren everywhere: in the mirror, in the shadows, in the corner of my eye. He would appear out of nowhere, his eyes burning with hatred, his twisted smile sending chills down my spine. And every time he would try to kill me, to finish what he had started. But every time he would vanish before he could strike, leaving me trembling, terrified, and utterly alone. I started to lose track of time, my days blurring together in a haze of fear and confusion. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. All I could do was wait for the next time he would appear, wait for the moment when he would finally succeed in taking my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. He was always there, always watching, always waiting. And then, one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a faint, shuffling sound, like someone was dragging their feet across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat as I listened. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was making that noise, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes drifting towards the door, and that's when I saw him. Ren Oliver, standing in the doorway, his eyes burning with fury, his twisted smile wider than ever before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, I could see the shadows moving, shifting, taking on the shapes of other figures, other faces. They were all there: my mother, my father, my sister, my brother, all of them, standing behind Ren, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in pain. They were dead, all of them, but they were here, in my room, watching me, waiting for me to join them. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at them, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with terror. Ren took a step forward, his hand reaching out towards me, and I knew that this time he wouldn't vanish. This time he would finish what he had started. But just as his fingers brushed against my skin, the room exploded in light. The shadows screamed, writhing in agony as they were consumed by the brightness, their forms dissolving into nothingness. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, leaving me alone in the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. All I knew was that Ren Oliver was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was safe. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the nightmare had ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That somewhere out there in the darkness, Ren Oliver was still waiting for me, still watching, still hunting. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the hauntings grew more intense. Ren Oliver was relentless, his ghostly presence haunting my every step. But it wasn't just him anymore, there were others. Shadows from my past, memories twisted into something far darker. Every night, I would hear the faint tapping on my window, the same sound that had heralded Ren's first appearance. But when I looked, it wasn't just Ren standing there, it was my family, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes empty and hollow. They were reaching out to me, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving streaks of blood as they tried to push their way inside. I started avoiding mirrors, avoiding the places where the shadows seemed to gather. But no matter where I went, they were always there, lurking just out of sight. I could feel their eyes on me, feel their cold breath on the back of my neck. It was as if the very air around me had turned toxic, filled with the stench of decay and death. I couldn't escape it, couldn't run from it. Death had a grip on me, and it wasn't going to let go. Aunt May tried to help, but there was only so much she could do. She took me to therapists, to doctors, to anyone who might be able to explain what was happening to me. But none of them could. They all said the same thing, that it was grief, that it was trauma, that I was seeing things because my mind couldn't handle the loss of my family. But I knew better. This wasn't just in my head, it was real. I could feel it, the cold touch of death wrapping around my soul, trying to drag me down into the darkness. It wasn't long before I started to doubt my own sanity. The lines between reality and nightmare began to blur, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced that Ren was standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes burning with hatred. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there, just the empty room, the shadows dancing on the walls. But I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. I could feel the cold spot where he had been, could see the faint outline of his figure in the darkness. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. Jude, my cousin, started to notice things too. He would catch me staring off into space, my eyes wide with terror, and he would ask me what I was seeing. But I couldn't tell him. I couldn't put into words the horrors that were haunting me. Jude was strange, always had been. He was a few years younger than me, a sullen, moody kid who rarely spoke and spent most of his time alone. He had a fascination with death, with things that crawled and slithered in the dark. He would collect dead insects and keep them in jars, watch them decompose with a detached curiosity that made my skin crawl. But there was something different about him now, something darker. I would catch him watching me, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. It was as if he knew something he wasn't telling me. One night, after another sleepless night filled with nightmares, I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was the same shuffling sound that had preceded Ren's appearances, but this time it was different, softer, more deliberate. I crept out of bed, my heart racing, and slowly opened the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. I could barely make out the shape of a figure standing at the end of the hallway, their back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the figure. It was Jude, his dark hair messy, his clothes rumpled as if he had been sleeping. But there was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were listening for something. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but the words died in my throat when I saw what he was holding. In his hands was a jar, one of his many collections, but this one was different. Inside, there was something moving, something alive. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was writhing, twisting, trying to escape. Jude seemed transfixed by it, his eyes locked on the jar, a faint smile playing on his lips. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jude," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the jar, his smile growing wider. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, the same cold that I felt whenever Ren was near. But this time, it was different. It was coming from Jude. I took another step forward, and that's when he turned around. His eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something in them that made my blood run cold. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he slowly raised the jar to his lips. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place, as he unscrewed the lid and tipped the jar towards his mouth. The thing inside the jar slithered out, its body long and slimy, like a snake. But it wasn't a snake. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. It wrapped itself around his arm, and he let out a soft laugh, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Do you see it now, Charlotte?" he whispered, his voice low and sinister. "Do you see what's coming for you?" I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch in horror as the thing wrapped itself around his neck, its body pulsating as if it were feeding off him. Jude didn't seem to mind. He just smiled at me, his eyes cold and empty. "You can't escape it," he said, his voice echoing in the darkness. "No one can." I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But before I could move, Jude took a step towards me, his smile widening. "It's your turn now," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "It's your turn to face death." I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the wooden floor as I fled down the hallway. I could hear Jude's laughter behind me, cold and mocking, as if he knew something I didn't. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I collapsed on the lawn, gasping for breath, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? What was that thing? And why was Jude acting like this? I didn't have any answers, only a growing sense of dread that something terrible was coming, something that I couldn't escape. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Jude as much as possible, but it was hard. We lived in the same house, shared the same spaces. Every time I saw him, my heart would race, my breath would catch in my throat. He didn't say anything about that night, didn't act like anything was wrong, but I could see it in his eyes, the same cold, empty look that had haunted me since my family's death. And then, one night, everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by making a cup of tea, when I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the walls. My heart skipped a beat, my mind flashing back to the tapping on my window, to Ren's ghostly figure standing outside. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, just the wind. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. I set the kettle down, my hands trembling, and slowly made my way towards the basement door. The closer I got, the louder the tapping became, until it was echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my hand on the doorknob, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run. But something compelled me to go down, something dark and sinister that I couldn't resist. I opened the door, the hinges creaking, and slowly descended the stairs. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars and bottles, each one containing something strange, something unnatural. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the air thick with the stench of decay. And then I saw him. Jude was standing in the center of the room, his back to me, his hands clasped behind his back. He was staring at something on the floor, something that I couldn't see from where I was standing. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I slowly approached him. "Jude," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. His gaze fixed on whatever was lying at his feet. I took another step forward, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. And that's when I saw it. It was a body, lying on the cold, concrete floor, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The face was hidden in the shadows, but I didn't need to see it to know who it was. It was Ren. His body was cold, lifeless, his skin pale and translucent, like a ghost. But this wasn't the Ren I had seen before. This wasn't the ghostly figure that had haunted my dreams. This was something else, something far more terrifying. I could feel the bile rising in my throat, my stomach churning as I stared down at his lifeless form. "What have you done?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. But Jude didn't answer. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on Ren's body, a strange smile playing on his lips. "It's not over," he said, his voice low and eerie. "It's never over. You can't escape it, Charlotte. You can't escape death." Before I could react, before I could move, Ren's body began to twitch, his limbs jerking as if something was trying to take control. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene unfolding before me. Ren's body convulsed, his chest rising and falling in short, sharp gasps. And then, with a final, violent shudder, his eyes snapped open. They were dark, empty, filled with a cold, unyielding hatred. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment, I could see something flickering behind those dead eyes: recognition, anger, pain. And then he smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Hello, Charlotte," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural growl. "I've been waiting for you." I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at him, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't Ren. This wasn't the boy I had known. This was something else, something far darker, something that had come back from the dead to claim me. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. Death had a grip on me, and it wasn't going to let go. Not until it had taken everything from me. The days leading up to my final confrontation with death were a blur of terror and confusion. I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake from, haunted by shadows and ghosts, by the twisted memories of my family and the relentless pursuit of Ren Oliver. My mind was fraying at the edges, unraveling as the reality of my situation became clearer. Death was coming for me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed me, but I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Aunt May, bless her, tried her best to protect me. She had always been my rock, the one person I could turn to when the world seemed too overwhelming. But even she was powerless against the forces that were closing in on me. She watched helplessly as I spiraled deeper into fear, her once comforting presence now tinged with her own growing dread. She knew something was wrong, something beyond grief or trauma, but she didn't know how to help. She couldn't see what I saw, couldn't feel the cold grip of death that had wrapped itself around my soul. But Jude could. There was something dark and twisted in him, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. He seemed to understand what was happening to me in a way that no one else did. But instead of helping, he reveled in it. He watched me with those cold, empty eyes, a twisted smile playing on his lips as I struggled to keep my sanity. It was as if he was waiting for me to break, waiting for the moment when I would finally succumb to the darkness. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I had been having nightmares, the same ones that had plagued me since my family's death. But this time, they were more vivid, more real. I could feel the cold breath of the shadows on my skin, hear the faint whisper of Ren's voice in my ear, calling me, taunting me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But I didn't know where to go, didn't know where I could possibly hide from something that wasn't even alive. I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaking, and made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear the fog of fear from my mind, but it didn't work. The terror was still there, gnawing at my insides, twisting my stomach into knots. I looked up at the mirror, expecting to see my own pale, frightened face staring back at me, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. It was Ren, standing right behind me, his reflection twisted and distorted in the glass. His eyes were dark, filled with that same cold, unyielding hatred that had haunted me for so long. His lips curled into a twisted grin, and he raised a hand, reaching out towards me through the mirror. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, as his fingers brushed against the glass, leaving streaks of blood in their wake. "You can't escape me, Charlotte," he whispered, his voice low and sinister, echoing in my mind. "You can't escape death." I screamed, the sound tearing through the silence of the house, and turned to run. But the door slammed shut in front of me, trapping me in the small, confined space of the bathroom. I was shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I pounded on the door, desperate to escape. But there was no way out. I was trapped, cornered by the ghost that had been hunting me for so long. And then the lights went out. The darkness enveloped me, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, could hear the faint, mocking laughter of Ren echoing in the darkness. I stumbled back, my hands groping blindly for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the cold, the darkness, and the relentless presence of death. I don't know how long I was in that darkness, trapped in that small, cold bathroom, with Ren's voice echoing in my ears. It felt like hours, days, and eternity. Time had lost all meaning, and all I could think about was how desperately I wanted to escape, how desperately I wanted to survive. But there was no escape. There was no way out. And then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back on. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness, and looked around the bathroom. Ren was gone. The door was open. But the sense of dread, the feeling of being hunted, hadn't left me. If anything, it was stronger than ever. I stumbled out of the bathroom, my legs weak and trembling, and made my way down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get out of the house, had to get away from the darkness, from Ren, from death itself. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There, at the bottom of the staircase, stood Jude. He was waiting for me, his expression calm, almost bored, as if this was all just a game to him. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and malevolent, that made my skin crawl. He was holding something in his hand, a small silver knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. "Where are you going, Charlotte?" Jude asked, his voice cold and mocking. "You can't run from this. You can't run from this." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my mouth frozen in fear. All I could do was stare at him, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to move. Jude took a step forward, his eyes locked on mine, his smile widening. He raised the knife, the blade catching the light, and I knew, in that moment, that he wasn't going to let me leave. But I wasn't going to die. Not like this. Not at his hands. Something inside me snapped, a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins, giving me the strength to move. I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the wooden floor as I fled down the hallway, Jude's laughter echoing behind me. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get away, had to survive. I reached the front door, my hands fumbling with the lock, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if it was sealed shut, trapping me inside the house with the darkness, with Jude, with death itself. I turned, my back pressed against the door, as Jude came around the corner, his smile widening as he saw the fear in my eyes. "There's no escape, Charlotte," he said, his voice low and sinister as he slowly approached me. "There's nowhere to run." I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, as he raised the knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. But just as he was about to strike, the lights flickered again, plunging the house back into darkness. I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, as he moved closer, his breath hot on my skin. But then, there was a flash of light, a bright, blinding light that filled the room, and Jude's scream echoed in the darkness. I didn't know what was happening, didn't understand what was going on. All I knew was that I had to move, had to get away from the light, from the darkness, from everything. I stumbled forward, my hands groping blindly in the dark, and felt the cold night air hit me as the door finally gave way. I was outside free, but I didn't stop running. I couldn't. I ran through the yard, through the gate, and into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get away, had to survive. But as I ran deeper into the woods, I could feel the darkness closing in on me, could hear the faint, mocking laughter of Ren and Jude echoing in my ears. I was shaking, my legs weak and trembling. As I stumbled through the underbrush, my mind screaming at me to keep going, to keep running. But there was no escape. The darkness was all around me, suffocating, relentless, and I could feel death's cold grip tightening around my heart. I stumbled to a stop, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and looked around, my eyes wide with terror. The shadows were closing in, dark and menacing, and I could hear the faint whisper of Ren's voice in my ear, taunting me, mocking me. "You can't escape me, Charlotte," he whispered, his voice low and sinister, echoing in the darkness. "You can't escape death." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows melted away, the darkness receding, and I was left standing in the middle of the woods, alone, shaking, terrified. I didn't know what had happened, didn't understand what was going on. But I knew, in that moment, that I had survived. Somehow, I had made it through the night, through the darkness, through death itself. But I wasn't safe. I knew that now. Death was still out there, still watching, still waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed me. But I wasn't going to give in. Not yet. I was going to fight, to survive, to live. No matter what it took, no matter how hard it was, I was going to keep going. Because I wasn't ready to die. Not yet.